Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with EC Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings, and every episode I have the privilege of having a discussion with EC on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, it's our goal to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you so much for tuning in to the show. Hello, and how are you, EC?
Good. How are you?
I'm excellent. We're going to talk about dementia.
Cheery.
And the role perhaps that nutrition and lifestyle changes play in it.
Yeah.
Before we dive in, I'd just like to remind folks, if you are listening but not yet subscribed or following the show wherever you are listening, please do. That will ensure you do not miss another episode. And we thank you in advance. Okay. Where do we start? What's the context here for dementia? Let's maybe just make sure we're using the word as in the same way. So what is it exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I actually was triggered to do this episode. We had that hotcakes recently on Alzheimer's.
Yep.
And so then I was like, you know what? Let's just make this a podcast. See what information is out there on this. So yeah, dementia is really an umbrella term. It's not really a specific disease. And dementia is this impaired ability to remember, think, make decisions that interfere with everyday activities. And so within this umbrella of dementia, there are different diseases. It's probably obvious, but also I think worth mentioning there's gradations in terms of how much somebody's everyday life is affected. And so generally there's just a progression of this to where they might be very self-sufficient in the beginning and ultimately needing a full-time caregiver. There is also, besides dementia, there's also just mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, which, like it sounds, someone's memory, ability to function is hampered. But the main difference between MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia is whether or not everyday life is really interrupted. Like with mild cognitive impairment, yeah, you might forget where you put your keys and it might take some time to find them, but you aren't lost on the way to the store, right? Now, sometimes mild cognitive impairment progresses to dementia, sometimes it doesn't. About 10 to 15% of individuals with MCI go on to develop dementia each year. You know, when I said that, I'm sure somebody thought, oh gosh, I've misplaced my keys all the time, right? Like everybody does that. Everybody forgets people's names at times. Those aren't surefire signs that somebody has cognitive decline and is leading to dementia. It's more about the frequency at which it's happening, as well as the real big one is the interference with day-to-day life. That's really truly indicative of a problem where things like, you know, medications and finances, transportation, all of those basic really living things become interrupted. And that's obviously when it's a problem. Now, we all know statistics can be presented in different ways. I like the way that the UK Alzheimer's Society presented it because the risk of dementia does increase with age. So for people between 65 and 69, it's around 2 in every 100 people have dementia. But then that risk doubles approximately every 5 years. So once we're over age 90, around 33 out of every 100 people have dementia. So in the US, there's approximately 6 million people that are currently living with dementia, and the four most common forms of dementia are Alzheimer's. That's about 60 to 80% of cases. Then we have vascular dementia. That's about 10%, Lewy body dementia, and then frontotemporal dementia. And so that's why we hear about Alzheimer's so much. It's the most common, 60 to 80% of the cases. And again, we're going to have some natural age-related memory things like, where did I put the car keys? But once we're getting towards dementia, it more is like, I'm lost in a familiar neighborhood. I'm using odd words to describe very usual things. And I think one of the trademarks for Alzheimer's is a lack of recollection about something that happened maybe minutes or hours ago. Unfortunately, dementias like Alzheimer's do not have a cure. There's actually been a couple FDA-approved drugs with some mixed and controversial efficacy. And so really there's still a lot of interest in what we can do, both from a drug perspective in terms of curative, but then of course also from a prevention point of view.
Okay, so obviously we're gonna stick to the preventative end of that conversation. So my guess is that just like, you know, I think we talked briefly when we had our episode on cancer, where we talked about like, I think a lot of people want to look to diet and nutrition as a, I don't know if buffer is the right word, but a buffer against the possibility of cancer, Alzheimer's, dementia. What does that look like as in the context of this conversation?
Yeah, one of the most researched diets related to dementia is what's known as the MIND diet, so MIND. Before getting into the specifics of that diet, I do want to point out why it's important in research to really have these specific and different diets. What's interesting is I think I spent a lot of time on this podcast trying to tell people why diets aren't different, right? Being like, they're very similar. They're just cutting calories and you're adding more quality and all of that stuff, right? But from a research perspective, it's really important that we have these very specific different diets, like differentiating this MIND diet from the Mediterranean diet, because we want to be able to replicate that diet between different research groups and to see like, okay, they got the same result and they got the same result with lots and lots of people. Some of the limitations when I was looking through the existing research, there's a Gutierrez 2021 paper in the show notes that was looking at 61 randomized controlled trials to dates on cognitive impairment. Well, it's literally like apples and oranges. I mean, one group is adding an avocado once a day, another group's adding tart cherry juice, another group's adding vitamin D. So it's just this whole mixture. It's like we don't have any sort of replication. And so this is why having these very specific diets, and the Mediterranean diet is one of the most well-studied one, but now in terms of cognitive impair, the MIND diet has become quite well studied. And so it's a way that researchers can replicate it. Okay. The acronym MIND stands for Mediterranean Diet Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. So the title kind of gives it away. The MIND diet is basically a combination of the Mediterranean diet, which I'm sure people know a bit about, but then also the DASH diet, which I don't know that we've really talked about as much. The DASH diet is the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. So it's kind of known as like the low blood pressure diet. Now, what's important about these diets, you see them often described as dietary patterns, not like a diet. And the point is, by describing them as dietary pattern, is that your diet isn't about whether or not you just eat beans or not. Your diet is the collection of all the foods in your diet. And so that determines the value of it. And so more recent research tends to look now at dietary patterns, eat these types of foods, limit these types of foods across all of your days versus saying, let's add an avocado and see what happens, which is great in my opinion, right? We've talked ad nauseum. We need to look at the whole diet. So in the email that I'll send out this week, which you can sign up at optimizemenutrition.com/email, you'll get a table that more specifically delineates the differences between DASH versus Mediterranean and this MIND diet. But generally the trends across them are, guess what? You're going to be eating more whole foods. They're going to tell you, eat this much amount of veggies and fruits and whole grains and fish per day or per week. Now, they also tend to list some restrictions, and depending on which of the three diets, they might say, hey, you can only have this much amount of sweets or butter. For the sake of time, again, I don't want to go into all the individual components of these diets, but for the MIND diet, what's clearly different from the other two is that they specifically call out eating leafy green vegetables at least 6 times a week, as well as berries twice a week. And the MIND diet also has the greatest number of restrictions out of the 3 diets. They say fast food, less than once a week. Olive oil is the only real oil you're using. Butter, less than 1 tablespoon per day. Cheese, less than once a week. Sweets, less than 5 times a week. And alcohol, only up to once a day. And so with this MIND diet, the research that has been done to date is largely association studies. So they survey a group of people, see what they're eating, see how it falls out relative to these MIND diet characteristics, and then determine if they're more or less at risk for having or developing dementia. And so this is from the Kaori paper. In the show notes is 2021, a systematic review. Their conclusions were that adherence to the MIND diet was superior to other plant-rich diets, including the Mediterranean diet, in being associated with better cognitive function. And without getting into all the weeds, cognitive function's assessed in lots of different ways. And so it wasn't perfect across all of them, but it was better than these other diets for a positive outcome.
Interesting. Okay, so what about the MIND diet do you think makes it, if we want to call it superior, what makes it superior? Is it those specific differences that you highlighted, right? The leafy greens, the berries,
right.
That is the ultimate lever that is pushing it in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely tempting to think that, when I've even heard about the MIND diet, people are like, oh, it's leafy greens and berries and stuff like that. When I was reading for this, I was reading this paper that was just about nutrition and Alzheimer's, and it starts talking about the importance of antioxidants, which we're going to discuss in a moment, but it's listing some of the antioxidants or nutrients needed for antioxidant activity, and it's like vitamin C and vitamin E and glutathione and creatine and carotenoids. And the list goes on and on. Okay, so I'm like, okay, we can need our antioxidants. And then you get to the section that's like, why we need vitamin B6 and vitamin B12 and folic acid. And then the next section goes on to like why we need these various fatty acids. And by the time you get to the end of the paper, you realize, oh yeah, we need all of the essential nutrients. And I find this a lot with a lot of different kind of health outcomes. It's just sort of like, find me the health outcome that doesn't need all of the essential nutrients of the vitamins, the minerals, these health protective compounds, while not overeating the processed stuff, right? It's not there. And so that's perhaps why they're essential nutrients, right? They're essential for all of these different health outcomes we want. Now, what's really interesting is I started off by talking about antioxidants. Vitamin E and vitamin C are powerful antioxidants, but we find that those don't actually improve cognitive function when we take them in supplemental form. No surprise. So here we are again, comes back to the totality of the diet. It comes back to the dietary pattern, you will. Do we have a good balance of quality and quantity in the whole thing? And so even that Kaori paper that found the MIND diet, was more beneficial than the other diets. I think it's interesting. They kind of talk about why dietary patterns are useful. And then they're like, yeah, but leafy greens and berries are so good. And it's like, no, guys, the value of this thing is because the whole thing is then resulting in a better diet overall. And so I'd actually wager it's less about the berries and the greens. I mean, sure, those are healthy foods. Of course, eat them as part of your diet. But I actually think why the MIND diet, and we'll see with research to come if I'm right or not, why the MIND diet has some better success is because of the greater number of limitations. Less than fast food once a week, less than 5 sweets a week, up to 1 alcoholic drink per day, right? Like less than 1 tablespoon of butter a day. It's cutting back on all of the stuff that we're overeating. So in my opinion, because it has a few more restrictions, it's probably getting a better balance of quality and quantity overall. Not that the berries, while very healthy, are doing something so much above and beyond. And one of the reasons why I believe that is one of the mechanisms that is believed to be part of dementia is this oxidative stress in the brain. So oxidative stress is when there's a higher number of these molecules called free radicals, and these free radical molecules cause damage. They can cause damage to proteins, cells, and damage means things don't function the same way. Now, free radicals are produced as a part of normal energy production, just us. Talking right now, we do produce free radicals. It's in all the cells that we have, right? So the more energy that you produce, the more free radicals will be generated. And so if you're eating in excess, okay, that might be pushing us towards more free radicals being generated. So quantity, this is why quantity is related to health. Again, this isn't meant to scare you. Free radical production probably is at play when we look at just general aging, why there's wear and tear. But in the cases of, dementia, and when we're looking at brain scans and we see that there's these plaques that people will talk about in the brain, or that there's these clumping of proteins, it's perhaps the oxidative stress, potentially from too much quantity of food, still being determined if this is really the mechanism at play here, but potentially the oxidative stress is then damaging those cells and those proteins, therefore interfering with normal cognitive function. And we do have ways that the body handles these free radical molecules, which again, sometimes are our antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, among a whole bunch of others. But potentially another way to mitigate the free radical production would be to decrease the quantity coming in. And so we do actually find that there is an association between obesity and dementia, and potentially it's because of this oxidative stress piece. There's just too much quantity in the diet. And so again, I think this is why the MIND diet might be showing a slightly superior result. Given the list of rules and restrictions in the type of food environment we know, I think it's resulting in a better quality and quantity overall balance. Again, plenty more research needs to be done to shake this out if I'm right or not.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that's what you pulled out of that it might be that there are, it might be the restrictions, given that we've talked a lot about quote unquote restrictive diets, right? And maybe the appeal of them, but perhaps not the efficacy of them. So is it that these particular restrictions are sustainable, or is it that they're kind of permissive, but they give some constraints around the idea of like, you're going to do this anyways.
Right.
And so let's just give you the number at which you want to do like one alcoholic drink a night. Okay, cool. I've now got permission. I know I'm not supposed to do 2, 3, 5, but 1, I get my 1 glass of wine and that's okay. Now I'm good now. So in other words, it's like, to me, what's really interesting, and what's really interesting about the 800 gram diet or challenge and lazy macros is it creates sustainable constraints. It says here, do this to this degree, and you're okay as long as you live inside of those constraints. It's not too hard, but it's enough to kind of create some intention and some awareness and actions as a result. So I guess all that to say, is that kind of what you think is the secret sauce here? Is yes, restrictions, but not overly restrictive?
Yeah, I mean, they also do look at adherence in these studies to obviously say, like, were they actually adhering to the MIND diet, and those people also were better off. So there are going to be people who just don't adhere to it. But I do think that having some permission is huge. And the fact that they're saying sweets up to 5 times a week, that yes, people then can still have sweets. And like you said, the alcoholic drink. And so I think that's big. Now, what's interesting is these diets, these lists get so long of like, eat this much leafy greens every day and this many berries and this many vegetables and this many fruits, and then don't eat sweets 5 times a week. Sometimes I'm like, okay, we should just be weighing and measuring our if you're going to go through that. There is a point at which sometimes these lists, I'm like, okay, there's a simpler way to approach this, but I digress. I agree with you that I think some level of permission is necessary for them to be able to adhere to this, for sure.
I don't know why this popped in my head, but it's kind of like when you're at the gym and the workout's like this long chipper that's like 47 movements, and every 2 minutes you've got to go back over to the whiteboard. Totally. What's next? What do I do? And then that's the point, like you've just lost the stimulus.
Totally.
It's kind of the same thing as like, I have my 14 rules here and I can't remember any of them, so I have to continually check back on them.
Totally. I mean, I know we're on a tangent here, but that's actually, so before I came up with the 800 gram challenge, there's this book out there called How Not to Die. It's cheery. And in that, it's Michael Greger, if I'm saying his last name correctly, he has a list of kind of his 12 ideal foods to eat every day. I think it's 12. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I was doing that. And the idea was still in my mind, just add these. Just make sure you get these 12 things every day, right? But it became too much of a logistical nightmare. It's like, not every day do I have a 1/4 cup of fresh herbs around, right? And I think that was one of them. Not every day do I always have 1/3 of a cup of beans around. And so I loved the idea of the addition and stuff, but it was just like too much of a directive to really be useful in day-to-day life.
Okay, back on task here.
Back on task.
Are there reasons or weaknesses of the research that you feel like might be worth pointing out? Like it without knowing any more than what we've just talked about, is there a chance, is it likely that the MIND diet becomes just the next trend? It becomes, oh, now you've got to try keto or intermittent fasting or fill in the blank of whatever might be next. Do you feel like that's happening or going to happen, or is there something different about the MIND diet that will steer it in another direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to point out some of the weaknesses of the research for sure before we all think that the MIND diet is the new magic pill or whatever. Now, as a society, if we all did the MIND diet, we would be great. So I think it's a healthy diet. I just don't think that it's kind of the magic bullet. Right? Now, one of the reasons that I want to caution people about this research, while promising, it's mostly association studies to date. Now, generally, when we look at kind of a chronic disease like developing dementia, we have to rely on these association studies because we're not going to lock away people for 20 to 30 years, feed them fast food, and see if they develop dementia. We can't do that. That's not ethical, right? So we kind of have to observe what people are doing for long periods of time to see, like, hey, what factors might be at play. Now, I'm sure people know the problem with association studies include this correlation does not equal causation, that just because we see an association, there might be another variable in play that we're not measuring that's actually causing the result. Maybe people who eat healthy are actually also exercising, and it's really the exercise that's driving this. So this is the problem with association studies that we all have heard about. But the other one that I like to remind people about is this idea of reverse causation. So when we're interested in prevention, we pose the question, does nutrition prevent dementia? And so if they go out and they do an association study and they find that the MIND diet is associated with less risk of dementia, the obvious conclusion in many of our minds is, oh, okay, eating well will reduce my dementia risk. It's assumed that's the direction of action. What if the reverse relationship is true? Meaning, is the cognitive function driving the eating habits? So it could be that the loss of memory or cognitive function results in the individual making poorer diet choices. And that's why we see the association. There's also what's really interesting in the cases where we're looking at cognitive function is that because we don't have these individuals in a metabolic ward to truly observe what they're eating, and they're left up to telling us based on dietary recalls and food frequency questionnaires, hey, what did you eat last week? What did you eat last month? What did you eat last year? That if somebody doesn't have as good of a memory because of cognitive decline, how do we know that we're just not collecting erroneous data? Maybe their diet actually hasn't changed. Maybe it's quite like it was the year before, but their lack of memory is affecting the data that we're collecting. And so there's some really interesting issues at play when you want to look at diet and cognitive function in terms of how you are collecting data. And so, of course, I believe that there's benefits of eating whole food and that we should continue to do so. But I think it's really important to point these out because maybe, in fact, it's the cognitive function that's affecting the eating habits, not the other way around. Now, there really, from what I can see, are not a ton of randomized controlled trials. So this is what we would like to be able to make that causal link of like, yes, diet is the one that reduces risk. There was one I could find from 2022 looking at cognitive performance and brain structure in healthy obese women. So they don't have dementia yet. And obesity was selected again because of that link with dementia. They did find that the MIND diet improved brain size as well as decreased white matter, which is good. We want gray matter. We don't want white matter. Versus their control diet. But they also did note in that paper, they think their outcomes would be better if the MIND diet was done with some caloric control. So they actually would then dial in the quantity a little bit more. So that's interesting. That's just one study. And there also looks to be a large clinical trial underway. We won't have the results for probably another couple of years, but it's 600 some adults in 3 different areas, I think, of the US, and they're going to be, implementing the MIND diet or not implementing the MIND diet and see what happens in terms of cognitive decline. So that'll be really interesting to see when that is published. But so yeah, unfortunately, what we have, the body of evidence is mostly these association studies with some pretty big weaknesses.
Back to the idea of the preventative end of this conversation. We've talked about nutrition. What about other lifestyle factors may play a role, maybe worth mentioning or thinking about in that kind of preventative mindset?
Yeah, I mean, some of the basic stuff we talk about all the time, sleep, exercise. Sleep's a big one. It's believed that during our deep sleep, those brain waves actually help flush the cerebrospinal fluid that kind of encases the brain and where these toxins could build up. And so that deep sleep kind of is a flushing mechanism such that we'd want to make sure that we're getting enough sleep. And what's enough? Well, 7 to 9 seems to be pretty good. And you kind of have to pick what, works for you there. There's also then a Livingston paper from 2020 in the show notes that actually outlines 12 potentially modifiable risk factors in dementia. Now, there are some that I don't think are totally relevant to what we discuss all the time, but they do point out some things like less education, smoking, chronic diseases, as we've discussed, depression, physical activity, low social contact, and alcohol consumption all increase the risk of developing dementia. And so it kind of is, interestingly enough, really related to our last podcast that we discussed about 1% better every day. How does that link to dementia? Well, we kind of ended talking about how we can get so fixated on nutrition when in reality, there's probably these larger list of different factors or determinants that come into healthy aging. And if you recall, there was 10 and include things like self-awareness and yes, diet and exercise, but outlook and lifelong learning and social and community engagement. And so here we have another group sort of saying, hey, there's importance in terms of learning and social connection and physical activity as something to prevent or to prevent dementia. And so this is why just time and time again, I come back to these basics. I know it sounds so basic, but we have so much evidence to suggest that it's paying off in lots of different ways. Physical activity is great for preventing cognitive decline, in part because of kind of your motor and spatial awareness, let alone things like social contact that you might get from it or picking up a new sport or skill. And yes, and then the basics of diet. But there's so many other things to kind of factor or think about in your overall diet and lifestyle to get this picture right and most preventative.
Fascinating. Anything else on this subject of dementia or diet or cognitive decline worth mentioning before we wrap up?
I don't think so, except I guess just that reminder that I will send out in my email this week, optimizemenutrition.com/email, kind of a table, I think, that summarizes these different diets, DASH, Mediterranean, and mine, so you can kind of see the slight nuances between them.
Love it. Cool. Thank you everybody out there for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. If this episode or any episode resonated with you, it is awfully helpful if you share it with a friend, a colleague, a sister, a stranger at the grocery store. It helps new folks find the show, and we thank you for it. EC and I will be back next week for another episode of The Consistency Project.